I'd like to welcome everyone to this first presidential research series webinar of the fall 2021 semester for Dr. Chan Hellman's lecture on the science and power of hope. For those of you who know me well, you know I'm an optimist, and I participated in one of Chan's training events before, and I was pleased to learn I score as a high hope individual. So hopefully he'll have more to say about that a little bit later on. We had nearly 100 folks register for this event, so thank you for the great turnout today. Everyone can submit questions for the Q&A session at the end via the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and Dr. Kent Teague will serve as the moderator for the Q&A session today. You can submit your questions at any point during the lecture, and Dr. Hellman will address as many of them as possible after the presentation. It's my privilege to introduce my longtime colleague and friend, Dr. Chan Hellman. He's internationally renowned for his work on building a hope-centered response to trauma, with more than 150 scholarly publications and countless workshops in the areas of child maltreatment, domestic violence, homelessness, and more. He's focused his work on sharing the science and power of hope and our ability to overcome trauma and thrive. Dr. Hellman's been at OU-Tulsa since 2002, and he's a professor in the Ann and Henry Zara School of Social Work, as well as being the founding director of the Hope Research Center. So it's my great pleasure to give you Dr. Chan Hellman.
Well, thank you, Jim, and it's an honor to be here. It's absolutely wonderful to do the Hope Talk in Oklahoma. Been doing this all over the country and the world, and it's wonderful to be in Tulsa. So thank you for the opportunity to share this talk. I'll share my screen in just a moment and talk a little bit about some of the research that we've been doing. Essentially, I'm going to introduce the concept of hope and go over the results of a few of our more recent publications, research activities. But by and large, the conversation is going to be a summary of about the last 15 years of work around the science and power of hope. And then I thought towards the end, I would talk a little bit about where the research has transitioned into the work with many large organizations and systems relative to the training programs we've developed based upon this evidence. As Jim indicated, most of the work that I do is in the context of pretty high trauma and adversity, domestic violence, child maltreatment, food insecurity, etc. And it's just been an absolute joy to be at the OU-Tulsa campus that values so highly our connections with the community. I would not be able to do this work elsewhere. And so again, it's a real honor to be able to visit with all of you about this. As Jim indicated, I've done the Hope presentation and workshops hundreds of times, and I just have to disclose I'm incredibly nervous talking to my colleagues. It's a little bit different when you're talking to people you don't know, but I have to pass you all in the hallway, and so I'm a little bit anxious about this presentation. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. As Jim indicated, I'll do the talk, and then we'll leave some time for some Q&A towards the end. Have a little bit of some potential for some interaction in the presentation. So I don't know if people can use the chat function during this presentation, but if so, feel free to do that. So as mentioned, I'm the founding director of the Hope Research Center. I will tell you that I'm also very honored to be in the Ann and Henry Zara School of Social Work, to be with the colleagues here who are very, very supportive of this work. And and helping us share this message in the community and in the practice of social work. The Hope Research Center was actually founded in 2006, so we've been around for a little while. The original name was the Center of Applied Research for Nonprofit Organizations. We changed the name probably a little less than 10 years ago as we really transitioned into focusing all of the work on hope. The basic purpose of the Hope Research Center is to partner with human service organizations in our community, really to conduct outcome research or impact studies. Our human service organizations, especially in Tulsa, but certainly statewide and nationwide, are ever existing in a performance-based funding environment. And so the idea was to create a center that was really driven and led by students, but connected students with the communities in order to design these outcomes assessments. Many of the students who work in the center are ultimately employed when they graduate by these partnering organizations. So it's a really nice opportunity for shared learning that can take place in the community. So again, I'm very grateful for the support provided by OU-Tulsa. Our basic core philosophy in the Hope Research Center is we are applied researchers, we're applied scientists, and we really are driven by the idea of research-informed practice and practice-informed research, that there's this nice relationship between the community of practice as well as the research activities that take place. This is not about me as the founding director of the Hope Research Center. So we certainly have a team of individuals. This is only a few, some colleagues, faculty, as well as a couple of students. There are many students who I didn't have their pictures, so I couldn't build them on the frame, but this work is definitely based upon collaborations with our colleagues. So we're driven by three basic research questions. That is, how does the exposure of adversity and trauma influence hope? And I'll talk about this in a little bit more detail shortly. Another question that we're interested in is, how do program services nurture and restore hope for children, adults, and families? That is hope something that can be learned? Is it something that can be taught? And then finally, why does hope matter? What are the benefits of hope? And so our research agenda for the Hope Research Center can be really nailed down to these three central questions. So the first way to start this is to really go ahead and define what we mean by this concept of hope. And I don't know if you happen to be able to use the chat function. I don't know. I forgot to ask Bonnie if we can actually engage with you in the chat function. But typically what I do is, great, thank you, Michelle. I really appreciate that. So why don't we do this? When you think of the word hope, when you hear this, what comes to mind? What do you associate with this word hope? And if you don't mind, just type that into the chat function. What do you associate with this word hope? And I'll give that just a moment. As great, belief in something better, chance, optimism. Thank you, Martina, it's good to see you. Something will improve in the future. Great. Faith in the future, very good. So a whole host of terms and ideas coming through the chat function. So thank you very much for engaging. So while you're there typing, let me ask one more question. Is hope a feeling? Is it an emotion that we have? Or is hope a way of thinking? Is it a cognitive process? So just what would your thoughts be? So Melissa says both. So quite a few both. You'll have to trust me that I'm a nurturing professor, but I do want to point out that I did not offer both as an option for a response. And it was, is hope a feeling or is hope a way of thinking? So Go ahead and make a stand. What do you think? Good. So we're seeing quite a few way of thinking. Absolutely. Thank you. So here's the definition that we use. Hope is the belief that your future will be better than today and that you have the power to make it so. So the idea is that hope is a cognitive process. It is a way of thinking. And this is really critical to understand in all of this hope work, that hope is a mindset, that it is a way of thinking. And the reason that this is so important in this work is that if hope is truly a way of thinking, then we know it's something that can be taught. We know we can teach hope. If it was a feeling, if it was an emotion, then at best we would be able to help people manage it. But because hope is a way of thinking, we know we can teach it. And we are doing this work with early childhood, pre-K, all the way across the lifespan. So we know that we can teach and nurture hope. By the way, I will point out, I do have it on the slide, but the photo to the left was provided by Roger Randall, which I think is a wonderful picture symbolizing hope. So hope is based upon three basic ideas: goals, pathways, and willpower. And so goals are the cornerstone of our capacity for hope. Every one of us, from the moment we wake up until the moment we go to bed, we are pursuing goals in our life, whether in the short term or the long term, but we are goal driven. The question with hope is whether or not you have the ability to identify the pathways or the strategies that you're going to use to pursue and attain the goals. Pathways thinking also includes the ability to identify potential barriers and to engage in the problem-solving process to overcome those barriers, to pursue your goals, or to find alternative routes. This is referred to as pathways thinking. Willpower is really the motivation. It is the mental energy that we have to pursue those pathways. Willpower is really our ability to focus our attention and intention on our goals. So goals, pathways, willpower. It's a very simple concept. Now, it's important to recognize that both willpower and pathways are required for hope. We have to have both. If I, for instance, am highly motivated, I have a lot of desire for a goal, but I don't know how to get there from here, I would be lower in hope. Now, alternatively, it may be that I have the pathways, I know how to get there from here, I'm just not motivated to do that. Both of those scenarios represent the lower levels of hope. So both are required. Now, when I first was introduced to this concept of hope, that it is about goals, pathways, and willpower, it occurred to me, as all of the work that we had been doing in the research center, it occurred to me that this definition of hope, this language of hope, is really a description of the program services that occur in our communities. These are the concepts that describe the work of the nonprofit world, that each and every one of their programs have goals when they work with their clients. And their program services are, in fact, pathways of hope. So from a conceptual framework in building evidence-based program, we see that hope theory provides a nice framework to describe the activities that take place in our communities. Now, I'm going to ask you to use the chat function just one more time. And I want you to think about the way that we typically use the word hope in our everyday conversation. What are some common phrases that we have or that we typically use the word hope? Many of us have probably used it already today, but what are some common ways that we think about this? Right, absolutely, wonderful. Hope you have a good day, hope you feel well. You know, I hope the Sooners beat Texas, you know, in the Red River shootout. But I want us to recognize that when we typically use the word hope, we actually use it in the context of a wish. So I want to distinguish the word hope, or this concept of hope, from wishing. So when we have the desire, when we have the willpower towards a goal, but we don't have pathways, we don't know how to get there from here, this is really the definition of a wish. So for instance, it's very common for us to say things like, I hope there are no tornadoes this week, or I hope there are no tornadoes. Now, while I have a lot of desire for that, I clearly have no control over the weather. So it's really important, and it has been critical in this work of hope, that we make sure that we distinguish hoping from wishing. Because in relation to goal pursuits, when we have a wish, it is passive towards the goal. Hope is about taking action to pursue that future. So this is the core concepts of hope. Now, just a real quick summary of the literature. Why does hope matter? There's roughly 2,000 published research studies around this concept of hope. And we see that hope is a significant predictor of well-being, whether it's in mental health, physical health, and you can see some of the specific indicators. Social health, improved parent-child relationships, for instance, high connectedness, etc. In education, we tend to see K through 12. What we tend to see is that when children score higher in hope, they tend to have better attendance, better grades, better graduation rates, higher rates of engagement in the classroom. And there's about 5 published studies now that actually demonstrate very consistently that hope is a better predictor of first-year college performance than the ACT, SAT, or high school GPA. So hope actually predicts academic achievement and retention in the first year in higher education. So quite frankly, there are quite a few universities now in our state that are now using these hope scores as part of that application and tracking student performance. So you can see positive indicators from this concept of hope. Now, one of the things that we're very interested in is how does trauma and adversity influence hope? And so I just want to talk very briefly about some of the things that we found in our research, and then I'm going to transition to some very specific studies. But probably one of the most profound discoveries was this idea of how adversity begins to influence the nature of our goals. Goals are the cornerstone of our capacity for hope. And so here's what we found is that when individuals are experiencing adversity or have a history of trauma experiences to their adversity, they're much more likely to set goals that are avoidant in nature. But when we see that hope is nurtured or restored, we tend to see that goals are much more achievement oriented. And this is a critical framework to understanding hope. And so let me give you a real quick example of why this matters. So let's just hypothetically say that I'm a basketball player and I step out on the court. If my mindset is that I want to get the ball and shoot the winning shot for my team, that's an achievement mindset. But if I'm that same basketball player and I step out on the court and my mindset is, I hope they don't throw me the ball because I'm likely to lose it and really disappoint my team. This is an avoidant mindset. And you can imagine how I as a basketball player am going to behave on the court. If I'm an achievement mindset, I'm going to do everything I can to get the ball. But if I'm in that avoidant mindset, I'm doing everything that I can to avoid getting the ball. And so this is something that we found repeatedly in our research. And this avoidant mindset tends to be driven from a place of fear and worry. And so this is fairly significant. One of the things we also found is that when we're experiencing adversity, we become much better at short-term goal setting than long-term goal setting. With regards to pathways thinking, one of the things that we've discovered is that children and adults who have exposure to trauma tend to struggle with pathways thinking. In education systems, what we tend to see is that when a child hits their first barrier on the pathway, they have a higher rate of giving up, of quitting their goal pursuits, compared to children who have not experienced trauma and adversity. One of the really interesting things existing in the research on willpower, this is coming out of Florida State University, that suggests that, number one, that willpower is limited, that our mental energy is a limited resource that we have. And what some of this research is showing is that our willpower is actually associated with the glucose in our system, glucose as a source of energy. So these are some interesting things about how trauma and adversity rob us of hope. So I'm going to ask you a question. I do this in every presentation that I've given, a couple hundred now, whether in the United States or done this in Europe and the UK. Was fortunate enough to ask these questions in Israel as part of our wonderful exchange that we have with Haruf. But let me ask you this, just use the chat function. What is the opposite of hope? What is your thought on this? What do you think is the opposite of hope? Thank you, Brittany. Thank you, Carol and others. So you can see if you're watching the chat function, pretty consistent response that despair is the opposite of hope, is the typical response that we get. But what I'll tell you is that despair is still an important part of hope. And so the loss of hope is actually a process. And I'll just go ahead and say the opposite of hope, as you can see, is actually apathy. Apathy is when I look at a goal and I begin to realize that no matter what I do, I'm going to fail. No matter how hard I try, no matter what I do, I'm going to fail. So why try? So this is a giving up, this idea of apathy. Despair is still an important part of hope, because with despair, I still have a lot of willpower towards the goal. It's just that my pathways are significantly blocked. Now, most of our work is in this area of despair and apathy. So we're really trying to develop strategies that teachers, counselors, parents, coaches, youth ministers, other individuals in the community can use to nurture and restore that hope. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight a couple of the studies that we've actually published over the last couple of years. And we've been very interested in, obviously, the connection between the adverse childhood experience and other indicators of polyvictimization, and how that shows up with regards to engagement in program services, engagement in the school system, et cetera. And so one of our publications demonstrates that children and adults with an A score of 1 or higher have significantly lower levels of trust in professionals. And so the way that this shows up is that if I have a lack of trust in professionals, when I begin to engage and I don't trust you, then it's going to influence the way that I communicate with you, the way that I engage in program services. So you can see some of these psychological reactions to exposure to adversity and the experience of trauma. So for instance, highly physically and social or emotionally active, difficulty in calming down, holding on to grievances. So all of these things are the ways in which exposure to trauma and adversity rob us of hope. So some actual specific research studies that we've published. You can see this one was led by Professor Rick Munoz, who's our director of research in the Hope Research Center. And so one of the things that we're interested in is how does the adverse childhood experience, how does that relate to hope? And very early on, we saw that there was very little relationship. That is, when we began to look at the correlation between ACEs and hope, that relationship was very small. In many cases, it would be classified as meaningless. And what that did was it sparked this kind of research agenda about if there's no relationship, no direct relationship between ACEs and hope, then what is the mechanism by which this exposure to adversity sort of depletes our capacity for future-oriented thinking? And so this publication that Rick led with one of our students, Heather Hanks, demonstrated, again, the dashed line shows that the relationship between ACEs and hope is not statistically significant. And so in this structural equation model, what we find is that adverse childhood experiences is associated with a increased level of rumination. Rumination is when we are reflecting, ruminating on the past. That is, we're typically focused on some adversity that we experienced, trying to give it meaning, trying to understand it. And as you can imagine, being stuck in the past really is detrimental to our future-oriented thinking. And so we see that there's a significant negative association between rumination and hope. So essentially, the relationship between ACEs and hope is through rumination. So extending that research, again, Professor Munoz and several others of us from the research center. So we began to continue to explore that. And so what we see is that, again, in this particular study, no significant direct association between adverse childhood experience and hope. However, we see that exposure to adverse childhood experience has a significant positive association with post-traumatic stress, which has a very strong predictive association to anxiety, which then ultimately results in lower levels of hope. So again, the relationship between ACEs and hope is not direct. It is through these psychological processes of rumination, traumatic stress, anxiety, etc. And then one that we actually just published just a few weeks ago was accepted in the Journal of Family Violence. And we're really excited about this piece because it actually demonstrates the connection between childhood exposure to trauma and the influence that it has on secure attachments that children need with significant adults in their lives in order to flourish and thrive. And so here we see that the adverse childhood experience is detrimental to that secure attachment. So in a sense, exposure to adverse childhood experiences sort of elevates the possibility that I'm going to find other individuals as untrustworthy, not reliable. I have difficulty developing close, meaningful relationships, which then tends to reduce hope in that capacity. Now, what I really loved about this particular study, this publication, is that we actually, in all of the previous research, we were actually studying collecting data from clients who are receiving services from our wonderful nonprofit community. So children and adults and families who are living in very difficult situations. But in this particular study, the sample was actually providers. The sample was actually from a child maltreatment perspective. It was judges, it was attorneys, it was law enforcement, and it was advocates. So this wasn't the clients being served. This was the individuals and the systems serving those individuals. And the important aspect of this is that when we study this idea of adversity and hope, it's not our community, it's not our the clients being served, it's all of us. And this idea that even high achieving adults who have experienced these adversities have the possibility of struggles and reduced levels of hope. The state of Washington incorporated the Children's Hope Scale and collected data from roughly 10,000 8th, 10th, and 12th grade students. And so what we're able to demonstrate is the relationship between hope and youth depression. And so what this slide shows us is that these lower categories of low hope and slight hope, about 60 or 70% of those youth report depression. So again, sample size is about 10,000 youth. We see very similar patterns with suicidal ideation. So again, a very strong association between hope and different indicators of well-being. The good news, as I indicated at the very beginning, is that because hope is a way of thinking, we know that it can be taught. We know that we can teach this process. And in fact, this represents a very significant part of our research agenda in the Hope Research Center is what are the mechanisms, what are the strategies that we can use to develop, to implement so that we can nurture and restore that hope. And I will tell you that for our work in the Hope Research Center, we're very interested in specifically developing and testing this curriculum and these strategies that are accessible to teachers, to parents, to coaches, to community leaders. These are things that certainly therapists can use, but in our state in particular, in Oklahoma, the access that we have to mental health and mental health services is very limited. And so what we want to do is be able to create these very simple strategies that anybody in our community can use to nurture and restore hope, because ultimately we all have a role to play in nurturing hope in the children in our community. So just a real quick example of hope-based intervention that we tested. This is ultimately with about 3,000 youth from 25 states in a very specific intervention. It is a week-long intervention of, it's called Camp Hope. So this is a program for children exposed to domestic violence. Tulsa has a Camp Hope through our Family Safety Center. But what I will tell you is that this is a traditional YMCA-oriented camp, and we train 17, 18, 19, 20-year-old camp counselors. They get about 3 hours of hope training and then begin to implement those strategies during the camp. So this is the prevalence of adversity for these youth by type. So you can see that 80% of these youth witness domestic violence. You can see that roughly 45% of them have an incarcerated parent. And you can see the high rates of abuse, neglect, etc. So suffice it to say, these are very angry children in general, not necessarily all of them, but children that have had some very difficult situations in their young lives. So the intervention, again, is just a week long. It is a non-therapeutic intervention that is developed around each day, children setting goals and then developing pathways to achieve those goals. We measure hope 30 days before the intervention, the last day of the intervention, and then a 30-day follow-up. And so you can see the resulting increase in children's hope. And so what you see, for instance, in the pre-test to post-test is a significant increase in hope. But here's what I want to point out, is that this 2-point increase in a child's hope score, which in the scale, in the way that we measure hope, is not very much. This is literally going from the slight hope category to the lower level of moderate. But what we see in this 2-point increase in hope is that it actually predicts a letter grade change in the classroom. So this week-long intervention, we tracked a lot of these youth for a full year. And we saw that that 2-point increase in hope would actually predict a letter grade change in the classroom. And especially for our cousins over in the education building, you know that going from a D to a C average is a game changer for these youth. And again, you can see where that that work was published. We actually did get some really good support. Those of you familiar with the adverse childhood experiences, it's very familiar then with Dr. Folletti, who's one of the original authors of the adverse childhood experience study, provided a really nice endorsement on the science of hope as it relates to, as we begin to increase our understanding and awareness of the adverse childhood experience and its profound implications across the lifespan. We begin to ask the question, what do we do about that? What do we do about children and adults in our communities? And what we argue is that hope is what we do about that. Hope is the framework that we can use to nurture and restore well-being. This one is actually really exciting. This is with our child welfare providers for Oklahoma Department of Human Services. And so what we found was that historically, we tend to think that secondary traumatic stress leads to burnout. But this particular study demonstrated that actually burnout, this experience of emotional exhaustion, accentuates the probability of experiencing that secondary traumatic stress. And you can see that hope has a significant negative association with burnout. We've actually published several studies that show that hope is a protective factor for the workforce, and not just good for clients, but good for all of us. So I'm going to come close to wrapping up probably in the next few minutes, and we can transition to the Q&A. But what I wanted to talk about was that roughly this 15 years of research where we've had this fairly systematic approach to our studies, again, grounded in those three areas. How does trauma and adversity rob us of hope? Can hope be nurtured and restored? And then ultimately, what are the outcomes of nurturing and restoring that hope? So quite a few systems and organizations are now implementing this hope-centered framework that we've developed. And I'll just highlight just a couple of them. And this is just a sample of the organizations and systems that we're working with. But for instance, the Mississippi Supreme Court worked with us, and we've trained all 1,200 members of the family court system in the state of Mississippi. All 82 counties represented, all family courts, judges, attorneys, probation officers, advocates have all gone through our HOPE training. And judges in the state of Mississippi developed a bench card. It's a HOPE-centered bench card that judges use when running their courtroom. The Oklahoma Department of Human Services became the first state agency to become a HOPE-centered state agency. As of July of this year, we've trained all 6,200 employees across the Oklahoma Department of Human Services, the largest state agency. That work actually influenced Governor Stitt, who in June hosted a Leading with Hope Summit, in which we trained all cabinet members as well as all state agency leaders. We're now in negotiations for working with 111 state agencies where we will take all of the employees through this HOPE training. The goal is to become a HOPE-centered state. That is the framework. On Thursday, the First Lady, Sarah Stitt, is hosting the HOPE Summit in Enid, Oklahoma, where we will actually train an entire community. And I will say, and I'm not sure if Sean Schaefer's on the line, but the work that Sean Schaefer does in the Urban Design Studio here on campus, very influential in what we're doing with the Hope Rising Summit for the First Lady. Union Public Schools has created 117 curriculum activities for 6th and 7th graders that they use during homeroom. And you can see California and Washington. The one that I'm really proud of is that our federal organization, the Department of Justice, just closed a $4 million RFP for Hope-centered law enforcement. So 4 demonstration sites around the country were selected, and those police departments will go through this training to become Hope-centered. And in particular, it will be focused on the way that police departments interact with community members. So very excited that the Department of Justice endorsed the Hope-centered framework as a potential mechanism to improve the well-being of our law enforcement community, as well as developing and strengthening the relationships with the community. So this Hope-centered framework, this is my last slide, and then we'll transition. Kind of a summary of all of the research. And, you know, we certainly have been focused on individual well-being, children and adults, but we've also looked at how nurturing hope influences organizational well-being with regards to burnout, turnover, goal attainment kinds of activities. Certainly looking at community well-being with the First Lady's framework. We collected almost 2,000 responses now from 2 communities where we're looking at hope and well-being in both Enid and Duncan, Oklahoma. And then we tend to see in these multidisciplinary systems an improvement in communication, cohesion, trust. And then ultimately the goal then is how do we begin to influence social policy? Now, I will close in this way. One of the most profound things that we've discovered is that hope is a social gift. Hope is not something that we nurture and restore for ourselves. Hope occurs in the relationships that we have with each other. And so what we're really interested in is how do we begin to influence an entire system, whether that is our criminal justice system, whether it's our family courts, our child welfare system, our education system, where everybody has a role to play in nurturing hope in children and families. And for us, hope is never the outcome. Hope is always the process, and well-being is the outcome in all of our work. So with that, I think I'll quit talking and see if we have any questions.
Well, we do have some questions in the Q&A, and maybe I could read them out to you. I know you can see them as well if you go there, but this way it'll be more conversational. So Mary Williams in the College of Public Health has asked that, you know, you mentioned some colleges, universities use hope as part of their admissions process. And this seems disconcerting as a criteria because students with low hope may just need extra help to increase hope and recognize what they're capable of. So could you comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Mary, for that comment. Thank you for attending the session. So keep in mind that it's not being used as a selection criteria. It's actually being used as a framework to help guide that first year success. Because part of the process of working with these organizations, these universities, and whether it's student success, parts of the organizations, advisors, counselors in various colleges, by the way, including OU, and working out with the provost's office and training the advisors, is really about how do we nurture and restore that hope so that students have the opportunity to be successful. So it's really a framework for action about where the university can lean in, you know, to provide opportunities for all students. One of the things that we found in our research, for instance, very recently in working with the State Department of Education, is that first generation college students, a couple thousand folks in the study, but first generation college students score significantly lower in hope than the second generation counterparts. So Mary, our point is not to use it as a way to restrict access, but a way to ensure access.
We have a question from Melissa Wilson.
Great, Melissa.
Says, have you worked with any of the residency programs. So I am assuming she means School of Community Medicine residency programs to give your training.
Yeah, so I think in a couple weeks I'm working with OB, but I think it's in Oklahoma City. Was it a year or so ago that our pediatrics folks had me come in and do some grand round discussion, working very closely with our good friends, the Child Abuse Fellowship and Pediatrics, in the work that they're doing. Mike Baxter and Sarah Passmore and others who are doing amazing things in our community. And then Kent, as you know, one of our former students, Ashton Duncan, has just done some amazing work with Hope, really looking at student burnout and medical student burnout. So we're definitely interested. We've certainly have a good relationship with our cousins in the College of Medicine, but so far that's about all we've done.
So before I get to some more of the Q&A questions, there was a question in the general chat from Stephanie Ferris: is how do you help people stop ruminating and start hoping?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. For me, this is really, and I really debated whether to put this slide in there. But one of the things that we really look at is, where do we focus our attention? And so the idea is that if I asked each and every one of you to take a few moments and just let your mind wander, and then I brought you back and asked you, when your mind was wandering, did you go to the future? Did you start thinking about all the things that you have to do today still? I could ask you right now during this entire presentation, how many of you were doing that to-do checklist, kind of thing. We tend to be much more future oriented than past, reflecting on the past. The difficulty is that individuals who are experiencing adversity are more likely to ruminate upon the past or worry about the future, which leads to higher rates of suffering. So most of our work has been on how do we interrupt that rumination. And it starts with these very specific strategies of goal setting. Goals are the cornerstone, but you have to remember, you can't just ask. So if Kent is working with me and I'm ruminating on the past, Kent can't just ask me, Chen, what are your goals for the future? Because that has no meaning for me. If I'm experiencing adversity, what we have to do is get into the short term. We have to really lean into, what are the goals that you have? What are the things that you want to achieve this week or today? And use those strategies to start interrupting that rumination. And it turns out that it works. Our curriculum shows that we can see a significant increase in hope in about an hour.
Wow. So sorry, I was giving my own exclamation there, but that is very impressive. So Martina Jelly, who you know well, has asked, how would you recommend integration of hope theory into medical education, both for use in patient counseling and in personal development?
Yeah, so I will tell you, Marty, and thank you for the question and attending. A big fan of your work, by the way. When we work with an organization or a group, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to teach this framework of hope, but we're going to lean into nurturing your hope first. So if we came in and worked with the College of Medicine, and the ultimate goal was, how do we nurture hope and create a hope-centered system for the patients? Because we see, significant increase in health outcomes, for instance. But we're going to nurture your hope first, because you have to see it, you have to experience it. And so that would be our approach to that. I'm much more interested in a system framework than the one-off on this. Not
have
sure
one.
Marty's question, by the way.
I'm sure Marty will find you if you didn't.
He knows how to find
And, so we have one last Q&A question from Christy Roberts. And has hope been tied to executive function?
Yeah, great question. This is something that I've been very interested for some time. I had just an amazing moment last week where I found a few studies that actually began to identify some functional MRIs that began to identify which parts of the brain structurally were lighting up in the context of hope. And you could imagine where that would be, part of the prefrontal cortex in that. More importantly, though, there was some studies that began to show some of the neural training that can take place to show that when trauma has occurred, that there are still opportunities to nurture and restore that hope from the function aspect of the brain. And so clearly, when we think about executive function, which is planning, goal setting, self-regulation, all of those activities very much rely on our capacity to do those. However, the research still shows significant opportunities and gains when those parts of the brain have been damaged, but also in developmental delays. We're actually working with DHS on very specific intervention strategies for their developmental services division.
So we have one last question in the chat from Carol Stewart. It says, have any of the studies focused on children that experienced trauma in early childhood before they were verbal? Since memories cannot be accessed verbally in order to ruminate, how can we work with these children when they're older?
Yeah, so we're certainly increasingly interested in the idea of some of these infant mental health sort of opportunities. I will tell you that we just hired Ashley Kraft, who specializes in infant mental health in the Hope Research Center. She's going to work with us to begin implementing hope-centered strategies. So Carol, not anything that we have specific to your question right now. We're certainly leaning into that framework. But I will say that we have a really long relationship with the Parent Child Center of Tulsa that works in particular with the 0 to 3, 0 to 5 framework. And working with their child therapist, developed a behavioral observation measure of the child's hope to the caregiver and the caregiver's hope to the child. And what we see when those observations demonstrate significant improvements of the child's hope to the caregiver, we tend to see significant associations with standardized tests associated with parent-child relationship quality. Great question. We're interested. Let me just go stop there.
I think we have time for one more, and there's one last question in the Q&A from Brittany Graves. It said, in Oklahoma's plan to become a hope-centered state, will our state legislators receive this training on a hope-centered approach?
Yeah, so I love that question. And this is where probably a lot of we could learn a lot from our friends downstairs in public administration, could probably provide us some guidance here, especially David Blatt, who has a long history with the Policy Institute. I have actually visited with some of the legislative individuals, but in particular, the discussion turned around to not training so much the legislators, but the staff of the legislators, because when different lobbying groups bring forward potential legislation and they're trying to find a legislator to sponsor it, to endorse it, the idea is how do we train the staffers who are those front gatekeepers through this lens of hope? Regardless of the ideology, but if they can see things through the lens of hope and always use well-being as the guiding framework, I think there's tremendous opportunity there. And the governor is certainly very supportive of of this framework. It is his statement that Oklahoma become a hope-centered state.
We have some more questions coming in, but it's time for me to turn it over to President Sluss. And you can see those, in the chat and the Q&A, and maybe you'll have an opportunity to answer them. So I'm going to turn it over to President Sluss. And thank you so much, Professor Hellman, for an awesome talk and great Q&A session.
On Q&A.
Jan, thanks so much for giving a great presentation to kick off the academic year's presidential research series. Really appreciate all that you do, not only here at OU-Tulsa, but all that you do for our state. Kent, I'd like to thank you too for moderating the Q&A, and I'd like to thank everyone who is here participating in today's session. We're really happy to see the very active Q&A session that we had at the end. I'm glad everyone was engaged. Be watching for an invitation to the next Presidential Research Series presentation, which will be on November 26th. And as it turns out, it will feature Dr. Kent Teague and his work with the Integrative Immunology Center. So a very timely topic to be sure. It's great to be together with you all today to talk about an uplifting topic. It's good to have an uplifting subject with everything that we've been dealing with lately. So thanks to everyone, and I hope you have a great week.